Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of our Road to Recovery series, which is a series of commentaries on the COVID-19 crisis and the aftermath and the work we're doing and all the people we can learn from on how they're driving their recovery and what we can learn from that. So every month we talk to business and thought leaders to share what the pandemic has taught us and to think together with our listeners and about what this means for the future of HR, finance, technology, and work in general. So I'm Tom Holmes, founding director of Brand Performance, which is a technology agnostic consultancy that helps businesses to solve their HR and finance problems, digital transformation to the back office. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Banks, who's a senior director of global people and workplace at Nitro Technologies, to talk about the journey to becoming an award-winning great place to work and how we work in a digitally advanced world and what its challenges are. So morning, Katie, how are you?
Morning, Tom, not too bad. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to see you in a much brighter location than I'm in.
So, well, it's very frosty here beside me, or behind me, if you could see the ground. We have a nice covering this morning.
Perfect. So, Katie, you've recently been instrumental in building out the employee experience strategy at Nitro, focusing on the future of work and establishing a really innovative employee value proposition. But can you first tell us a bit about Nitro and your role there? So what is Nitro for those of us who don't know?
So Nitro is a document productivity software company. So we deal primarily in PDF documents and the e-sign space. So essentially what we do is we create software that allows you edit, create, manipulate PDF documents and then send them for e-signing. So for example, where you would have once had received a PDF document, you would have had to print it, mark it up with your changes, scan it and send it back to the person. That's all done within the PDF, which was previously unheard of because it was only editable in Word and Microsoft formats. So we work on that type of software, and then we also have an e-signing solution. So it's sending contracts, sending statements of work, everything for signing via the cloud. So it's really looking at that digital transformation of companies and how we're moving away from paper, sustainability, the environment, and becoming that paperless office and having everything else more real time and available on your phone and not having to print things, and scan them and moving away from all that kind of laborious work and overhead that companies have.
I'm assuming that during the pandemic, there's been an acceleration of the use of these kind of tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we found we grew by 35% in 2020. And we're probably going to do the same, if not a little bit more this year. And that's really down to companies who would have maybe had this on their digital transformation journey for another 3 to 5 years out, but suddenly found their entire workforce of knowledge workers working from home, no access to those big multifunctional printers where they're, standing over them, printing and scanning. So needed a solution. And obviously the software that we provide was able to solve for those problems. So while we may have been on their radar, it might not have been for another 3 to 5 years. And suddenly everything has been pulled forward. So we're seeing a lot of companies who maybe expressed interest now actually pulling the trigger and executing on that.
And I'm assuming that 35% growth is, that's a growth in revenue, but presumably employees as well. So throughout COVID.
Yeah, so that growth is actually the 35% is employee net growth. So that includes our new hires and attrition. So I think we're at about 40% personnel growth this year alone. We've actually established and opened a new North America hub in Toronto and Canada this year. We started that in January. We've been very successful finding talent there. And I think, again, that's as a result of the pandemic, because we no longer need to be centrally located in a US headquarters or in an EMEA headquarters in Dublin. It's about wherever you can find the best talent. So we found a huge array of talent in Toronto and in Canada. So we have a team of about 30 there now, and we only started hiring in Q1 of this year. And we've recently acquired a Belgian company called Connective. So they're one of the top European e-signing companies. So that acquisition is in process, but that will place Nitro within the top 3 e-signing functionalities and software in the world. So yeah, it's exciting.
So you're hiring, you're doing acquisitions and integrating other businesses into the business, you're opening new offices, you're working with new, so this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Just finally, before we get on to the meat, Katie, what's your role? So what do you do for Nitro?
So I'm Senior Director of Global People. So I actually oversee our entire global people function. So that's everything from HR to workplace to talent, and I report directly into our COO. So we have obviously a very globally distributed workforce. So it's about myself and the team, being business partner supports, first of all, to the managers and the employees, but then also how do we support a culture, maintain our culture and our values, but also support a culture of performance, engagement, everything from onboarding, offboarding, anything that really falls underneath the HR people remit sits within my function. So I oversee that globally, and obviously it's presented a lot of challenges over the last year or so, or the last 18 months, as we've kind of shifted to a remote workforce, but it's also been a very good learning curve, and it's been really interesting to see how the different regions have changed and adapted.
And location-wise, you talked about Dublin, and you talked about Toronto. What other locations is Nitro focused on? Or
yeah, so we were founded in Australia. So we have a small office still down in Australia where the company was founded. We were then headquartered from 2014 out of San Francisco. So that's, I suppose, still our headquarters as such. However, in the last 7 years, that has actually become one of our smaller offices. Dublin is now our largest office. It's our centre of excellence for our engineering and product hub. And we have every function represented there. We also have a team in the UK, a team in Germany. We will soon have a team in Belgium and France as a result of the acquisition. And then we have a couple of people dotted around Europe since the pandemic has begun, as we've worked remotely. And then we've added the additional Canadian hub this year. And then we also have a lot of people dotted around the US working remotely. So it's a really distributed workforce, with our 3, I suppose, main office locations being San Francisco, Toronto, and Dublin.
very interesting, because you're describing these different locations, but you're also describing what you could describe as kind of nomadic business, starting with a focus in Australia, moving it to San Francisco, and now focused in Dublin. That's very interesting. To move the locus of a business is actually quite a rare.
Yes, it is. It's and I think it's just how the business has evolved and where we've found talent. So the reason for opening the headquarters, the EMEA headquarters in Dublin, is because we had access to such great talent in Europe. So, I mean, the diverse workforce that we have in Dublin is outstanding. I mean, there's probably less Irish people in the Dublin office than there are in the Dublin hub than there is kind of different nationalities, because obviously it's a very easy kind of movement of people across the EU. So we have a lot of different nationalities in Dublin, and I think that's been the key thing for us. It's not about being, really stuck to one location. It's about where you find that the best talent. And before, yes, 2 years ago, that was really focused out of hubs or locations. So Dublin, and we would have had a Dublin office, and we would have sourced talent, but it would have been maybe people coming to Dublin to work or coming to Ireland to work. Whereas now we're actually using those hubs and creating spokes out of them as such to access the talent that is within the regions around, and employing them within those then kind of entities or offices.
That's really interesting. So what's notable to me about that is that the kind of what I'm describing as nomadism, and I'm sure you guys don't, but forgive me for using that word, but it's talent led. So it's finding the groups of talent and where it's possible to grow the business, which has led to that change in locus, and that also is quite unusual.
Yeah. And I think that has always been a real focus of ours. Like that's one of the reasons we established in Dublin, back in 2014, was because we had access to such great talent across Europe. And, that's only served us as we've grown. And then as we've done our research, kind of expanding in North America. So we obviously had a West Coast office. We had our European office. We had nothing on the East Coast, and it was about bridging that gap. And we did a little bit of research around, Boston or kind of Washington down the East Coast. But actually, when we got in touch with some of the development agencies, Toronto just stood out in terms of, kind of what companies were saying about relocating there, establishing there. And we've definitely seen the benefits of that since going forward.
Right. And have you been to all these offices in the last couple of years, Katie? Has that been really,
It's been difficult the last 18 months or so, and I actually was on maternity leave. I had my second baby just before we went into the pandemic. So because I was pregnant, I hadn't been traveling that much beforehand, but I would have been over to San Francisco probably once or twice a year. I haven't been there now since probably early 2019, but I was in our Toronto. Now we don't have the office actually established there yet, but I was in Toronto in September when travel opened back up to Canada. Met some of the team there. And it was really exciting. It was really motivating. It reminded me of Nitro when I joined 7 years ago and we were small in Dublin. It was the real kind of the excitement around, this new company and a new business and business growth. And, that team are probably joining at a more advanced stage in our growth than I joined 7 years ago. So you can see that excitement and that motivation. And even though they've all joined remotely, they've actually met up and formed friendships themselves within the city. So it's great to see. I met with some of the team there, and I've been over and back to London a little bit as well since travel has opened up. But I'm hoping to do a little bit more, fingers crossed, next year.
And I imagine you're not alone. I imagine there are many people in Nitro who have not visited the multiple offices over the last couple of years. And so you're working very virtually across these different entities.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who have joined probably April, May 2020 who have never seen a Nitro office. They've joined remotely, from their home office, from their kitchen table, and they have never ever set foot inside a Nitro office. So that presents its own challenges, but it's great to see that we've been able to adapt and evolve, to those challenges.
Well, that's really interesting because I know, and congratulations on winning your award of Great Place to Work in Canada. But, Katie, is there a place to work? If everyone's working at home, how do you win the Great Place to Work? So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we've obviously kind of shifted to a remote first, or what we call flexible forever approach to work. We will still have our offices, but they will, rather than assuming that everyone will be in an office, they will be at, say, 50% capacity. And what we'll do is we'll have a hot desking system and much more collaborative open space for people to meet. But people's primary place of work will be home, and I think that comes with a number of advantages, and still having that hybrid function and having that ability to attend an office. But I think in terms of the Great Place to Work, the place in that, we never saw it as a physical place. We saw it as, the company, the culture that you're working for. And shortly after we got the Great Place to Work in Canada, we got our US certification as well. So they were two, I suppose, great accolades and huge successes for us to be able to achieve within a pandemic, and especially Canada, because Canada's Great Place to Work survey was done with our Nitronaughts, as we call our employees, in the Canada region, all of whom joined remotely, have never seen a Nitro office. And our Nitro office is is what we would consider, you know, part of our culture and part of what attracts people, because it's very informal, it's fun, it's vibrant. And so to have the employees or the Nitronauts recognize Nitro as a great place to work without ever having set foot or seen a Nitro office was a huge success in terms of how we've shifted to that remote environment. But definitely we're going to return to some sort of hybrid working office, particularly in San Francisco, Canada, and Dublin. And we're actually just in the process of working through the reconfiguration of the offices. But it comes with so many advantages having that space for people that I think it's, you know, it would be foolish for us anyway, to try and navigate our culture without having some sort of physical workspace.
That's really interesting, though. So, because many of us have struggled to maintain a vibrant culture within our businesses, maintain engagement with people. And I think as the months have worn on of more and more of us working, but you guys have clearly cracked it. So, so really starting as an employee at Nitro when I never turn up to the office or see it, how does that work? How are you welcoming people to the virtual space?
So the employee experience is forefront for us, and I suppose when we shifted to the remote scenario, where our onboarding, which is critical, couldn't be done in person. I think part of what we looked at was how do we make that experience, you know, make somebody feel like they're part of the team even before they join. So we implemented a new software called NBorder, and it allows us actually. It's a workflow management tool, but it allows you to set up an onboarding workflow. So from the moment somebody signs their offer letter, they're added into this workflow, and every couple of days they get a new email or a text from Nitro with a little bit of information about the company. Maybe there's a kind of two paths to it. So there's a manager and a new hire path. So the manager will get an email, be asked to fill out some information. And then when that information comes through, that will go to the new hire. The new hire then at some point is asked, you know, what's your favorite 3 p.m. snack? What's your, you know, kind of how do you operate? Like, what's your favorite thing to do? How do you concentrate? Getting to know a little bit about the person, something that you might know by just sitting beside someone. So you'll know, like sitting beside someone, they go for, you know, a coffee and a fig roll at 3 p.m. But you wouldn't know that about somebody sitting at home. So it's interesting to get those insights into people. We get those before the person comes on board. They feel like they're part of a team before they even start on day one. And then on day one, we kick off our new hire onboarding, which includes meeting with certain team members. They have a mentor. They have what we assign as a Nitro mate. So it's a specific person within Nitro who is there for them to chat to every day, ask some questions. We had that before we went remote, but actually that's been probably a critical piece, you know, as we've switched to remote and virtual, because if you're a new hire and you're in an office, you can turn to the person beside you and say, hey, do you know how I find this? Or you don't have that when you're at home. So you need somebody that you feel comfortable going to and that you don't feel like you're burdening. And that's where the Nitro Mate comes in, because they've been assigned to you. So yeah, there's a couple of little things that we've done to kind of maintain that success. And I think, you know, it's very much about that employee experiencing the touch points along the way from the moment they sign the offer letter. So there's no big gap between signing the offer letter and 3-4 weeks later on a start date.
You found this tool NBorder,
yeah,
to be really good at doing that kind of workflow. I mean, I like the idea that you're mixing up presumably things like scan your passport and stuff like that and send us a utility bill with more kind of specific and personal questions.
Yeah.
And presumably the idea is to have a constant contact with them throughout the pre-boarding period.
Yeah. So some of the information that we send will be like, you know, our policies, and they can sign them through the workflow, and things that we would normally maybe do nearer day one or on day one, we do in advance, what we call pre-onboarding, but definitely the personal touch. So, you know, we ask the manager to give a little bit of insight as to like what it's like to work on the teams. They get an introduction to their team before they join through this workflow. So there's a little bit about each team member. They have, here's your team. Katie's going to be on your team. Katie is this person. This is what she does. So they have that familiarity. And then obviously the personal pieces. So we ask everyone to share, a funny story or something interesting about themselves, like that, their 3 p.m. snack. And things like that. And it just, when they join, then it's a great conversation starter, because we give everyone a welcome shout out on Slack, and we share their interesting story. And I've seen over the past year or so in particular, you might share a story where somebody says, I love horse riding, or I love playing hockey, and somebody else in the organization who could be thousands of miles away will reply and say, oh, I do too, or what's your favorite hockey team, or how long have you been horse riding? So suddenly you're getting interaction with people that you wouldn't normally have had by either joining remotely or even joining within an office. So yeah, I think it's just about adding that personal touch and really bringing somebody into the fold and making them feel like they're part of a team before they even start.
Is it a global onboarding process? So is it a similar experience wherever you're joining around the globe?
Yeah, so we have a consistent experience. Obviously, there's probably slightly different information in terms of policies and benefits and things that they'll get on it. But other than that, the general onboarding experience from an employee experience or a people perspective is very much the same. And I think that's the great thing, because we do that with our offices as well. And that's something that we're doing as we're reconfiguring them, is that no matter what office you walk into or where you go in the world for a Nitro meeting, and what team you're meeting, we want everyone to feel the same, and I think, and have the same experience. And I think that comes back as well to how we hire. So we have our core values and we hire to our core values. So actually, there's a lot of people form very solid friendships. We've had a lot of relationships come out of Nitro. I actually met my husband in Nitro, and it's because the people we hire all share the same values, because they share the same values as Nitro, and so you have a very good mingling and gelling of people and teams, and people start to feel like they have a best friend at work.
And how much do you think that is creating an environment which does that, and how much is it kind of the mission of the firm? Because you described this kind of the fact that it feels like, I mean, you're almost describing a startup feel in each of these locations, which is all bigger firms. All of us are incredibly jealous of creating that feel, because it's tough to do when you're coming from the other, from the other side of an established larger business, and then although you guys are large enough, but you know what I mean.
I think for us, we've constantly looked at it. We've never stopped iterating our processes, or never stopped iterating, how we do things. So for us, we're looking forward, right? So we're looking at technologies and how we integrate and people when we're maybe 1,000, 2,000 people, but maybe when you're a larger firm, it's maybe about looking backwards. So if you're at 100 people, 200 people, how do you create, what would you do to create that environment, or what would you do to create that culture? And then it's about applying that to the larger organization. So it might be very easy to do at 100 or 200. You might need to make some tweaks at 500. You might need to make some more tweaks at 1,000, and that's the way we look at it. It's constantly, we're rooted in our values. So I think it's about, everything that we do comes back to those values. So across the functions, not even just people, but it's, how we're interacting with people, how we're treating people, managers, everybody is aligned with those values. Our training is how we treat people on a day-to-day basis, and how we make people feel part of the company. So it's about taking that and scaling it.
And also, you're describing something which is a bit more fearless than some larger organisations. So, for example, using NBorder, I imagine sometimes it's not it's made mistakes. It's not perfect for certain people, etc. It's sent the wrong piece of data or something like that. But you know, that the fear of that can kind of paralyze the use of those kind of tools, I think, Katie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we've done a lot of testing on it before we launched it, and a lot of research before we engaged with the platform. And interestingly enough, we took their enterprise package, which would normally be for much larger businesses, which would be, you know, 1,000 plus. But the reason we took it is because we saw the value in potentially not just having it as an onboarding platform, but we do offboarding on it. You can do reboarding for people coming back to the office. We've done our security training through it, because you upload your own data onto it and it just gives you the template to create the workflows. So it's actually been very instrumental in how we're reaching people, and I suppose meeting people where they are, which is a big thing for us, right? So we talk about kind of benefits and things that we introduce, and we always come back to how do you meet people where they are. So we have everyone access to LinkedIn Learning, which is really very basic. I think it's probably for our size $15 per license, but everyone has access to thousands and thousands of learning paths, you know, courses, videos, tuitions. And again, it's about meeting people where they are. So we've met them on LinkedIn because everyone is really on LinkedIn. And then with NBorder, it's about meeting people where they are. So everyone is on their phone every day. So we have, you know, it either lands in their email or it lands as a text message. It's real time, and they don't have to go and log into another system to find out some information before they start. They get it and they can click through links. So it's really about, we took a step back and said, you know, how do we make this as intuitive as possible, this process, and not make it as an overhead for people where, you know, they feel at the end of the day, now I have to sit down, go on my computer, access this platform to input my information for my onboarding. They get a text message on their phone, they click on the link, they type in their information, they click send, and it comes back to us and we have it. So it's really about looking, like we did an awful lot of like research into the different platforms and looked for references within our network. And I think that that's a huge thing that I found as well in over the last 18 months is that I have a network of HR peers here in Ireland in the software company, in the software industry. And whenever I want to look for something new, so, you know, like that, does anyone have any experience with onboarding platforms? We send an email, there's a group email, and they'll come back with recommendations. Does anyone have a recommendation for a consultant for leadership development? And they'll come back with a recommendation. That network or that subset of people is hugely important, because that's where you'll find out what has worked for other companies, what hasn't, and you'll narrow down your search.
How did you create that network, Katie? How did you get into that network?
So that was actually just a small few of us who started it. So we worked in the same building as Nextrol, which is another software company. And myself and the head of people there, we used to meet regularly. We made the introduction through other colleagues within the company. And we met, and, you know, she would have been connected maybe with somebody from Workday or another software company, somebody from LinkedIn. And what we did is we actually talked about, we had a lunch one day, we talked about, you know, potentially like doing more meetups, but everyone's time was so stretched that that didn't always transpire. So what we said was we'd start an email thread, and over time what's happened is say, like I've even done it, I've been on the email thread and I've added one of the business partners on my team, because I've said that this might be helpful for them. And I just say, hey, all, introducing Caroline. She looks after X, Y, and Z. So when Caroline's looking for some information, she has the introduction to email them. And that group has just grown. It started from maybe 4 or 5 people, and I now think there's probably 25 of us in it. And it's just an email thread, an email group, and we just ping each other whenever any of us need some kind of touch points or bounce the ideas off people. And it's a really good way, because we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And even though we're probably competing for the same talent, we're all, you know, in the business, we're all trying to, you know, navigate changes and challenges. So it's been hugely helpful.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's a key thing. I mean, 5 to 25, that's kind of the size to have a really great personal network, and that's been active throughout the COVID crisis, I imagine, Katie.
Yeah, it's been really really helpful. I mean, it's been for a lot of, like, I've even found that I'm getting more emails from people, especially now around I suppose immigration, relocation, things like that, because that's now coming up as part of, you know, global mobility and as part of being kind of more remote. So what we were asking each other about maybe 2 or 3 years ago has now shifted to, you know, very different topics, but it's still the same. It's the same network. It's the same subset of experience.
Brilliant. Now, can I move on to some of the challenges you've had over the last 20 months? So what kind of challenges have you had, Katie? Or not all of them, but some of them.
So I think there's been a few. So I mean, obviously shifting everyone to a home office where, you know, people didn't necessarily have space for a home office. So you might have 3 housemates living together. They're all working from their room. They're all you know, waking up every morning, maybe going down to the kitchen, but then back up to the room and working from their room for the day. So, you know, it's about it was a challenge of managing that kind of like isolation, day-to-day stress, and the troubles that come with that, and obviously like mental health and things like that, which we're very aware of. I think there's been other things. So obviously, as we've become more distributed, we're relocating a lot of people, or people who moved to maybe Ireland or moved to San Francisco from different parts of the US now are looking to move home or relocate. So, you know, it's facilitating that and understanding, you know, how we facilitate that within each region and the jurisdiction. We found a challenge with some, I suppose, legal or government institutes who probably aren't up to, haven't caught up with the whole remote work scenario that the world is now in. So for example, we're relocating our CEO actually to London. He's going to spend some time in Europe as we grow the business. So he's relocating to London.
Katie, is this the same bloke who started in Australia, moved to San Francisco? Now you're moving him to London.
No, he's relocating to London, to grow the European market. So he's moving. He is Australian. He has a green card for America, so he's legally able to live and work there. We needed to get him a visa for the UK, which was very straightforward because he's a skilled worker, so he qualifies. Yeah. And, you know, that part was straightforward. What we didn't anticipate was that when it came to submitting the application, we needed a physical office address, which we don't have in the UK because it's not one of our main hubs. It's a spoke. So our team have access to WeWork spaces if they need to, you know, decompress, meet, get away from the home space. But they have a varied access to WeWork, so they can go to whatever WeWork they want. It's not a specific WeWork. And what we found was we couldn't make the application submission without a physical address. So my question to our legal team were, well, you know, with remote work, why do we need a physical address? And she said, well, the other side of that is the home office will say, well, remote work, why does he need to be in the UK? But that doesn't take into account time zone. So San Francisco is 8 hours behind the UK and Ireland. So of course he needs to be on this time zone because that's how you're going to be able to effectively do business. But that's where the catch up, I suppose, hasn't been entirely across every industry and every function. And that's challenging. So we ended up having to actually get a specific WeWork membership in his name and use the WeWork address. So we eventually got around it, but it was just one of those scenarios where we were like, okay, so there's still a bit of, you know, work to do around, I suppose, this whole concept of remote working and flexible working. So yeah, that was another challenge. And then I suppose the third biggest challenge we've had is actually around talent and interviewing. So a huge part, and I'm sure everyone who's ever been interviewed will say this, a huge part of an interview process, engaging what it's like to work at a firm, is walking into an office for an interview. You see other people working, you get a sense for the office, you see what the environment is like. Are people having fun? Are they all boxed away in separate cubicles? Is there nobody talking to each other? What's the environment like? Without being able to attend an office or a physical interview, we don't have that. So that's been very challenging to actually engage people over as part of a candidate experience. And I suppose we've relied heavily then on like Glassdoor reviews and, pointing people to kind of like our LinkedIn. We're kicked off in the latter half of this year a huge project around employer and talent branding. So really getting people to see what it's like to work at Nitro without actually ever having set foot in a physical workspace. But there's been a number of challenges that like the last year has thrown at us, some obvious, some probably less obvious, and you only experience them as you go through the process and you think, oh, I didn't think of this. I didn't expect this to be such a huge issue. Now we'll have to like add this to the list of things that we need to probably look at and address. And that list has grown over the 18 months, but we've ticked off a few bits and pieces and we're starting to make progress on others. So yeah, it's I suppose it comes back to always being open to adapt and iterate and just being able to, take a step back. And if you have to start something from scratch, start it from scratch, and not set everything in stone as it needs to be this way and no other.
It's a very strange thing, the interview element, isn't it? So much of it was, I think that a lot of us have realized how much of it was actually a bricks and mortar and physical experience, which was allowing in particular the candidates actually to get a feel for what the working at the business is like. And, it's almost the most important part of the interview is whether it's a great cultural fit, etc. Yeah. And we were expressing that through our physical locations largely. It was kind of, we all know that walking through the doors of a company immediately gives us our perception of what that company is like.
Yeah.
And doing without that is really hard.
Yeah, and I think as well, there's certain people are really good with virtual interaction. They can sell themselves, they can have a full-blown conversation. Other people are not as comfortable with it, and actually they're much different in person. I've even found that with my team, we hired obviously I've hired a few people remotely this year onto my team, and I met them for the first time once restrictions started to ease. And actually relationships with some individuals have strengthened since we've met in person, because actually in person it was a completely different experience to online, because for that person they maybe felt a stronger ability to interact or connect or share their feedback, share their thoughts in in a one-to-one scenario as opposed to virtually, and also you get a sense of somebody more than just kind of shoulders up. You get to see is this person tall, are they short, all the assumptions that you make about someone, and you really can tell a lot about someone by a handshake, by how they carry themselves, by the natural side conversations and that you would have with someone that you don't have on a virtual call. So like when you're interviewing someone in an office, they come in, you might say, oh, can I get you anything? Can I get you a cup of tea? Would you like a water? And you might walk them to, your canteen area, you get it. And during that time, you're like, oh, did you, do anything today? Where did you travel from? And you start that organic conversation. When you virtually meet someone, I've done virtual interviews and it's the same. I do try and have a little bit of rapport before we enter into the kind of the actual interview, but it's the same conversation. It's like, how are you? How are things there? I see you're working from home. It's you're not really finding out, about that person as such, as you would in meeting them physically. So yeah, I think there's been, the office challenge, but then also kind of interaction and personality has played a huge part in how people act virtually.
It's very interesting because not all of us or not all of our colleagues have been as lucky as many of us have on getting used to these tools, learning how to work with them, all that kind of stuff. And if you don't have that skill set, it can really disadvantage you in an interview state. And I imagine, Katie, you're looking for talent of very different kinds. Not all of your talent is presumably people who are great presenters and talkers on this kind of environment. But sometimes you're looking for technical skills and other skills which might not be best showcased in this kind of online environment.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. So we do, as part of all our interviews, we do a culture interview. So we have somebody who's not necessarily maybe part of the team that person, the candidate, would be joining, but it's somebody in the business who's a culture ambassador. So it can often be somebody from my team. I've done them, kind of somewhere maybe longer term Nitronauts. And what we do is we have that person just have a very informal conversation, just to, I suppose, assess, that the individual's personality outside of structured questions. So it's more about getting to know them. What did you love about your last job? Like, what did you love about your last manager? Who was your favorite manager and why? So it's those kind of more relaxed questions, but you really get insights into people. But from my experience, I've definitely experienced you do a culture interview with a salesperson versus a culture interview with an engineering person, and it's very different, because salespersons are selling, they're selling themselves, they're really geared up for kind of the extrovert, chattiness. Engineers, on the other hand, are probably on the flip side. They love to code, they love mastering their skills, they're really, really technical, but they're not necessarily salespeople. So they might not sell themselves the best, but you just adapt, I suppose, culturally. You can adapt and ask, well, what made you get into engineering? Why do you love to code? What piece are you most passionate about? And, the conversation naturally starts to flow, but you would not compare an interview from a salesperson with an engineer person. So it's really important to adapt, I think, the interviews as well to who you're interviewing, and noting that everyone can share the same values. So core values can be the same, but personalities don't have to be the same. And, not necessarily career goals don't have to be the same. I mean, somebody wants to eventually become VP of sales doesn't mean an engineer wants to become VP of engineering. They might just want to really be a great engineer.
I'm personally finding that, in every interview I do, I differentiate between those people who I know are a great fit, and then I might identify someone who I know is not going to be fit well within the team, etc.
Yeah.
And then I've got that group in the middle where I'm not quite sure, and they refer them to, and I'm finding that group in the middle is growing since we moved to online. That there's more frequently I am not sure or unsure, and then refer to a second or third interview. And so what we're finding is that we do more interviews with more various people to try and, make sure that we're not missing someone who is really talented, and where the environment or whatever hasn't quite brought that out.
Yeah.
And I think that's really really interesting. So I've got a question from Michelle, which is, how do you ensure that the cultural ambassadors don't have any bias in their interviewing, etc.? So you at the speed of growth, Katie, presumably you have to rely on a large number of interviewers, etc. So how have you worked with them to avoid any bias?
So we actually have, as part of anyone who goes through, or as part of an interviewing panel, they go through interview training, and part of that interview training is actually unconscious bias training. So, and it's something that, diversity, inclusiveness, and equity has been a huge part of our projects this year, and it will continue to be as well. So I think our culture ambassadors, they're culture ambassadors for, I suppose, a reason. So most of them actually wouldn't have biases, because they would know that they'd be like myself in the people team, or some of my people team members. They take a step back and they assess each individual for who they are. And that's the reason they're cultural ambassadors, because they're aligned so well with our values, and they're aligned so well with how we operate. And we don't have any, I suppose, overarching concerns that, you know, there would be any bias or the kind of lack of, you know, proper interviewing being done when they're part of a panel. But I think the biggest thing is anyone who is a part of an interviewing panel, all our hiring managers go through it, but then anyone who's part of a hiring panel gets pinged kind of just, it's a short training, couple of slides, and then it's actually an unconscious bias kind of training. And we use a TED talk by I think it's Jerry Chang is his name, and he gave a great TED talk on implicit bias. That's, I think you can find it on YouTube, and it's really, really interesting. And then the implicit bias tests by Harvard EU, they're free to do online. So we encourage everyone to, you know, it takes 10 or 15 minutes. And as part of Global Diversity Awareness Month, we actually opened that up the entire org and said to people, if you have the time, go in and, you know, select one or two of the tests. So there's everything from gender, religious bias, you know, race bias, and it was really kind of bringing that back on the individual to understand. And I mean, I've done the tests, and I've even found, you know, myself, oh wow, I didn't realize that I had that maybe that inclination of a bias, but I obviously do. And it just makes you more aware. Like, I mean, it's subconscious and it's unconscious for a reason. So you're not ever going to be able to perfect it, but there are things you can do to become more aware of it.
So there are three things we need to understand: conscious bias, unconscious bias, and implicit bias. And you're suggesting that on TED Talks that looking for implicit bias is actually a really useful thing for anyone who's not aware of that third term.
Yeah, I actually think that TED Talk, and I can share it with you after Tom, if I can find it for the group today. But it's really interesting. I think it's about 10 minutes long, but you can partake in it almost like if you're sitting watching it. And it's so interesting how he talks about it, and, you know, what he makes you see that goes on kind of in the brain as you're associating words together that you might not think you would associate. So it's very, very interesting, and it's more of an eye-opener. And I think all of these things come back to just giving people a little bit of an eye-opener, creating a little bit of awareness step by step, without forcing, you know, a days-long training on, you know, unconscious bias on someone. It's about, you know, kind of giving them piecemeal pieces where they take a step back and they actually think, oh, wow, I didn't realize, but actually now I've done that test, or now I've listened to that talk and, you know, kind of taken part as an audience member in that talk. I can see how this would become a bias, or how this might happen.
I'd love to watch that, actually, because I am not aware sufficiently of what implicit bias means, and I'd like to learn instantly, actually. So that would be great if we'll
yeah,
get there.
I'll root it out and find it. I often have to just go back and search, because I've shared it so many times, but I can never remember where I've shared it.
Now, Katie, we're nearly out of time, but I wanted to ask you one last question, kind of putting you on the spot, because you talked a lot about the working virtually, all this kind of stuff, but I understand you're opening offices. What are you doing that for? What you know, surely that's the old world, right?
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to, so we have our offices in Dublin and San Francisco, so we're reopening those. We're reconfiguring them. I was just in the Dublin office last week significantly. So like we've reduced desk capacity by 50%, and we've created more open collaborative spaces. We're doing the same in Toronto. We're actually just in the lease process in Toronto, and we're nearly at signing on that. And I think
buying an office as well. It's not just taking the old ones, and you're actually buying it. So what on earth are you doing, Katie? Why is this?
I think there's a huge advantage to having some level of office access, right? So as I said, we have all our remote staff with access to WeWork, right? That doesn't mean they go in every day. Yeah. Everyone's primary office will still be home, but actually having a space for people to go in and collaborate is hugely important. So I think from an onboarding perspective, it's going to be great for new hires to be able to come in, maybe meet their team for one team meeting a week, you know, and put faces kind of to names and actually see people in the flesh. there's an element that's lost when you're virtual, and that's the element of organic learning. So that's the bit about sitting beside someone and listening to them do their job, particularly in sales. Maybe, you know, how are they selling? What are the questions they're being asked? Being a salesperson, being on a call or coming off a call and saying, I have to follow up with this client. They asked about this. Have you come across that before? You're asking someone directly there. It's a real-time answer. It's organic learning. And, you know, even coffee, water cooler chats, coffee chats, you know, things like that create a huge sense of engagement, and they really add to your culture. So we didn't want to lose that entirely. But we also don't want to mandate that everyone should be in an office. So we want everyone to have the flexibility. And this is where I suppose flexible forever comes in. We're forever going to be flexible, where people, if they want to work from home full time, they can. I mean, I would probably work from home full time. I may go into the office once or twice a month. Other people might have a necessity to go in once or twice a week. I think what we found, particularly people with families, midterm breaks, summer holidays, they find it very hard to work from home, because they, you know, there's just not enough space. If you have 2 or 3 kids running around and you're trying to work, you're on calls, it's very difficult. So it gives a space or an outlet for those people for maybe 1, 2, 3 days a week to be able to log on to our
You're finding that the WeWork environment doesn't provide that kind of private ownership, collaborative environment.
It does for our remote employees, but we don't have WeWork access for all employees, because any employees who are centered, say in Toronto or San Francisco or Dublin, they would have to travel to a WeWork. So the whole concept is that it actually works out more cost effective for us to have a location where X amount of people can come into. So I think that's one of the things that we're really reopening for, I suppose, and looking at that hybrid solution, is because there is an element of collaboration in everybody's job. And I've even found that, you know, as things have opened up in the last few months, particularly in Ireland, I've met 1 or 2 of my team here. And we get a lot more done, maybe over, like it's been over a coffee, you know, maybe in a coffee shop, maybe in a hotel foyer, but we actually get through a lot more than maybe we would virtually, because when you're virtual, you book back-to-back calls, right? So you're on a call and then you're going to the next call. It's like you don't give yourself time in between. And I think it's about that. I think it's about allowing for that level of collaboration and in-person communication to some extent, right? We're never going to go back to a space where we have everyone needs to be in office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We understand now that doesn't work for people. People have relocated. The commute is a nightmare. People have much more, you know, there's way more mental health benefits to not commuting, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a balance to be struck where, you know, there is benefits to actually having that space.
Now, we're nearly at the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank you, Katie, for sharing with us your views on being flexible forever, which I love. Also telling us a bit about the world of the Nitronaughts and Nitromates and all that stuff. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. That was fascinating.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. And if there is one thing that I could just share as a kind of as a parting line, it is that we have completely shifted a lot. Productivity has come up a lot as part of, you know, working from home. How do people remain productive? So we've actually shifted to a thought process where we look at output over hours worked. It's very simple. It's just those 4 words: output over hours worked. So if somebody wants to walk their dog at 11 a.m., if they need to go to a doctor's appointment at, you know, 3 p.m., that's fine. If they don't start till 9:30, but they finish then a little bit later, that's fine. It's really just like if somebody can do their job essentially in 4 hours every day and they're being super productive and they're doing everything that they need to be doing, fair play to them, let them take the time. But it's really not, it's shifting away from that 9 to 5 in an office, at your computer, at a desk. It's about output. And I think that has been huge for us during the pandemic, because it's given people the reassurance that they have that flexibility and that they can take a step away for their own mental health if they need to.
Love it. Katie, thank you so much. And the audience are mindful of output out of hours work. So I'm going to give everyone back their last 5 minutes and wish you all a great day. So thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar, which is one more before Christmas. Thanks a lot, and thank you again, Katie.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Cheers.